So today we're going to walk through the process for configuring the SurePassID Radius server. And the application we run is the SurePassID Radius Configuration Manager. As you look at the Configuration Manager, there's 4 different tabs that let you specify different configuration parameters to specific portions of the way the server will operate. On the main tab, Radius Settings, you can turn on and off the Radius communications so that Radius server is not listening at this moment in time. The Radius server is deployed as a Windows service, so you could also stop it there, or you could stop it from here. You also specify the port that you want to listen on. 1812 is the default port for Radius communications. In SurePass, you can make it any you like, whatever you want the Radius server to be listening on. If you have other applications like NPS from Microsoft, that might be using 1812 already, so you can use a different port as long as the VPN client and the VPN server are all in agreement on what that is. You can also have multiple different SurePassID Radius servers, all listening on different ports to do some form of load balancing. And the Radius server itself can be put behind a load balancer for UDP packets, which is how Radius communications are performed. So the Radius server is designed to only allow communications from known, trusted appliances and endpoints. And so here you can see there are 3 that show up on the summary screen, but if I click the edit, I can add many. This can also be imported from a different system where you could hand edit these, as all the configuration parameters are stored in a place where you can actually edit them. But if you do not specify the proper IP address and the shared secret between the VPN or the Radius appliance and the SurePass Radius server, they will not be able to communicate. The second tab, the server endpoints, kind of sets up the SurePass server location, what the SurePass endpoint is. In this case, we're using the SurePass sandbox. This could be an on-prem location. Once you pick it, you can specify test server location. So if I wanted to go to So if I went to this endpoint and I did test server connection, tells me that I can get to the server. The point of this is to make sure that A, you can get to the MFA server, and 2, there's no firewall or any other type of networking issues between the Radius server and the MFA server. Now below here, you can put in your SurePass server requires an API key. So we would have an API key specified for Radius communications. I can have multiple API Radius key. These are defined in the MFA server. And I would specify the API Radius key. Then I would do the test server credentials and it would tell me that I can actually get to my tenant and have the authorization access rights to actually talk to the server. So there's 2 parts. Can I get to the MFA server? And when I get there, can I get to my tenant with the proper configuration of what's allowed and the policies for that API key, in this case called API Radius-ID. Second part of configuration is what should the Radius server use for first factor and user authentication, and we give you a variety of different choices. So SurePassID is a good choice if you want to not use Active Directory or another directory and obfuscate users' credentials. Certainly you can use Active Directory. You could use, and you need to specify the Active Directory domain server that we will actually talk to AD to authenticate you. You could use LDAP directly, which could be LDAP to AD, but that doesn't really make perfect sense. But if you have a Linux server that, are you running Open LDAP somewhere else, you could use that. We can also do proxying in the Radius server, and we can also just say, what, we're not going to do first factor, we're only going to do the second factor. And for this to work, this option here, you need to have the appliance needs to be in agreement that it will do the first factor, and SurePass will only do the second factor. So in this case, we'll change it to Active Directory because that gives us some other additional options. When I go to security options, I can specify what authentication methods are allowed in the Radius server. And there's actually two places that you can specify this. One is in the API key on the server, and you can specify it local. And in this case, we're going to specify it local. We would specify all the different methods we want: OTP, passcode, push authentication, calling users. The push authentication also includes FIDO push authentication if you're looking for phishing resistant MFA in a Radius environment. You could do SMS, and you can send a passcode via SMS. So there's lots of options here depending on what you're looking to accomplish in terms of giving people different authentication methods. You could use you can also tell the Radius server to use Active Directory security groups and say, look, only apply MFA to this Active Directory security group. You can also specify a single factor authentication security group and say, these guys always get single factor, and this guy's always have to do MFA. There's other ways to implement this in the product that's more granular in SurePass, but given Active Directory integration, this is like a good option for slowly onboarding users or only selecting users that are part of an administrative group. Additional options, we have username pass-through, which is something to deal with in certain situations. It may make sense to pass through the name that's entered by the user, as opposed to SurePass takes the username and kind of strips off by default the domain name if it's included in there, such as matt@domain.com. If you want domain.com to be passed through the SurePassID server, matt@domain.com, you would check this as let the username pass through to the MFA server. There is a trace viewer, everything that's done that you can open up here to look at the trace. The trace is in a well-known spot. The trace is identified, by a date timestamp, and you can see everything that's going on in the MFA server. Typically, those types of traces can also be used for ingesting into SIEMs that go with the SurePassID SIEM integration product, or either in a Splunk or Windows event log, and we support up to I think a total of 6 other places you could also stream all your logs. So fully comprehensive SIEM and source support. Once you get done, you just say okay and close it. The Radius configuration, the Radius server will always pick up the changes that you make here, even if it's up and running. So there's no reason to start and stop the service. It's smart enough to start it to refresh the parameters and for all new incoming connections. And that's the configuration for SurePassID Radius server.